The proposal would come to be known as the Blossom Plan, named for Virgil T. Blossom, superintendent of Little Rock Public Schools. Under Blossom's plan, desegregation of the schools would follow the city's residential patterns. As one school board member suggested, the plan would provide as little integration as possible for as long as legally possible. Mann would be built on the predominantly black east side of the city and would remain all black. Hall High would be built on the other side of the city in a more affluent white area, and no black students would be admitted. Central was surrounded by working-class white and racially mixed neighborhoods, and would become the first testing ground for school integration in the city. I watched Mann slowly rise from the dirt when my friends and I carpooled or took the bus to Gillen Park to swim during the summer of 1955. I couldn't help thinking that in a few years I would be a student there. Even then, I thought it made no sense that I would have to travel even more than the 2 miles I traveled to Dunbar when Central High School was so close to my home. But high school was on the back burner. I was just looking forward to returning to Dunbar for 8th grade. In August that summer, though, a brutal crime came nearly 200 miles away in Money, Mississippi, rattled me to the core. I first heard the name of Emmett Till whispered from the lips of adults, speaking in hushed tones around my house around the horrible thing the white people did to the little black boy in Mississippi. My parents subscribed to the Chicago Defender, the city's black newspaper, and it was there that I first read the full, terrifying story. As I followed the story for weeks in the black press, I couldn't get the images out of my head. How Till, a 14-year-old Chicago boy visiting his great-uncle in Money, Mississippi, walked to the white-owned Bryant's Grocery on August 24, 1955, with some white friends after a long day in the cotton fields. How the teenager, unfamiliar with the deadly taboos of the South, may have whistled at a white woman while leaving the store. How Roy Bryant, the store owner and the white woman's husband, showed up 4 days later with his half-brother at the home where Till was staying and dragged him away. How Till's battered and mutilated body was pulled from the Tallahatchie River a few days later. How the body had been weighed down by a 75-pound cotton gin fan attached by barbed wire. As horrible as those images were in my imagination, nothing could prepare me for the real-life pictures I saw when Mother's September 15th, 1955 issue of Jet magazine arrived at our home. As I flipped open the magazine and turned to the story about Emmett Till's memorial service, I gasped. The photo of his badly disfigured corpse was right there in black and white. Part of me was so horrified that I wanted to turn the page quickly or throw the book down, but I couldn't take my eyes off his bloated, monstrous face. It was one of those moments where legend meets reality. I had read stories about the lynchings of black folks in Mississippi and other areas of the Deep South. I even heard my relatives tell the story of a lynching in downtown Little Rock. A woman who appeared to be in her early 40s sat on her porch about 5 blocks from my home every day, just staring at passers-by, with empty, sad eyes. Her mind was never quite right, my folks said, because her brother had been lynched on Broadway when she was still in her mother's womb. To me, such stories were tragic yet distant history. But I knew Emmett Till. I had never laid eyes on him before the magazine photos, but in the handsome face of the boy he had been before his murder, I saw my cousins, my friends, my classmates. He was just 1.5 years older than me, and as real to me as the black playmates I met on the softball field every day. I imagined that Emmett was probably a popular teenager, eager to show off his big city ways to his small-town southern friends. Like my cousin Robert Henry, whose prowess in the field near my house, and no small amount of envy, had gotten him kicked off our neighborhood softball team. I imagined that the country store where Emmett may have acted on that dare of his friends at summer day looked like Mr. Thompson's shop, the white-owned store across the street from Uncle Teet's house. And what teenager hasn't said or done something silly to impress others? But Emmett's death said to me that for a black child, a little too much confidence, a joke, or saying or doing the wrong thing in the wrong place at the wrong time, or just being the wrong color, could cost his life. Because of what happened to Emmett Till, Mississippi, became a fearsome place in my mind, and I never wanted to set foot there. That must have been the case with the adults in my family too, because from that moment on, Daddy mapped out our road trips so that we never passed through Mississippi. Those were the days before the interstate highway system, and sometimes we might have gotten to our destination quicker by going through Mississippi, but we weren't taking any chances. Somehow, though, I still did not see Little Rock through the same eyes as I saw Mississippi. Yes, Little Rock was the South. Yes, I had to sit in the back of the bus and climb to the black section of the balcony when Peggy, Reba, and I walked to the Lee Theater for the Saturday afternoon show. Yes, I heard white folks making degrading comments, and even though I had relatives who lived in the predominantly white neighborhoods in the West End around the 202-acre War Memorial Park, I knew I couldn't swim there because the pool was for whites only. Yet, in my mind, my hometown was not as bad as Mississippi. Till's murder is at the bar for racist evil in my mind, and compared with that, Little Rock was somewhere on the other end of the spectrum, or so I thought. At that point, I had always played by the rules. I had never stepped out my so-called place. That would come a few years later, and I would be shocked and saddened to see my hometown for the first time as it really was. In some ways, though, Little Rock was more progressive than many areas of the South. The city's public libraries had been integrated without any trouble in January 1951. And despite the limitations and motivations of the Blossom Plan, the Little Rock School District was among the first in the South to respond in any way to the U.S. Supreme Court decision mandating school desegregation. But black residents in Little Rock were growing restless at being treated like second-class citizens. With the massive show of black togetherness and power taking place in Montgomery, Alabama, at the end of 1955, some black residents were also starting to feel empowered. I recognized the infectious power of the Montgomery movement one day in early 1956, when my cousin Dolores and I decided to ride the bus downtown. As we stepped on board, we noticed Alex and Duncan, one of the granddaughters of the older couples, lived across the street from me. Alexian was in her 20s and had spent some time in Denver, Colorado, where her father operated an upscale men's clothing store. Like me, she had traveled up north and lived another way. Dolores and I waved hello, and we sat across from her in the middle of the bus, where the black section began. The bus grew more and more crowded as it traveled down the Park Avenue. Suddenly, at one stop, a white passenger boarded, and the driver looked up at the rearview mirror at me and Dolores and shouted over her shoulder, "You two girls, get up." We knew he meant for us to go to the back and clear that road for white passengers. Without the question, we were about to comply when I heard a sharp reply from across the aisle. "Oh, no, you don't. You stay right there." Dolores and I froze in our tracks and looked up. It was Alexian. She was fuming. Her arms were folded across her chest, and she was staring at the bus driver down. "We had a right to sit there," she demanded. "Hadn't he heard about the Montgomery bus boycotts?" I had felt such pride reading about how the black people of that city were refusing to ride public buses to protest the city's segregated practices. I eagerly followed the news stories and photos in black newspapers and magazines, showing how 50,000 black men and women were there walking together, walking and carpooling to work, church, and everywhere else they had to go, while empty buses crisscrossed the city. I knew the whole story. How a small act of defiance by Rosa Parks had ignited the boycott. What a gracious lady. I imagine that she was just bone tired that day when she quietly refused a white driver's bus orders that she give up her seat to a white passenger. I had sat in the bus next to many black women like her in Little Rock. They would be headed home from jobs cleaning, cooking, and sewing in white people's homes and businesses, so tired that they could barely keep their eyes open. When I saw that iconic black and white photograph of Rosa Parks being fingerprinted after her arrest for taking such a bold stand, I thought of all the hard-working women she had lifted by keeping her seat. And she became forever my shero. I knew that Alexian was probably thinking of Rosa Parks and feeling the call of history to take her own stand. Hint, hint, she's taking a stand. But as she grew louder, refusing to back down, even if the bus driver threatened to call the police, I grew more frightened. I wanted to disappear. I wanted her off the bus. I wanted to tell her that I knew she meant well, but that I wanted her to be quiet, please, and let me go to the back of the bus. I've never been the kind of person to make a scene, and that was the last thing I wanted right then. But it was too late. The next thing I knew, the police were climbing aboard to escort Alexian off the bus. Dolores and I got off too, and quietly walked back home. I never talked to Alexian what happened that day, but I always felt horrible that she ended up in the hands of the police for standing up for me on that bus. Little did I know that another integration battle was heading in my town, and soon I would take my own stand.